All right. Ooh, that number keeps growing and growing. All right. Welcome, everyone. I do have it on gallery view, and wow, it's so lovely to see so many of you here for this very important talk about how we can engage in difficult conversations. You know, those conversations that really can, get under our skin, right? So that we can have these conversations in a way that can lead to transformation. So I'm Liliana Hernandez. I'm from the Center for the Advancing of Teaching, which is most commonly known as just CAT, C-A-T. And I lead the Contemplative Practices in Education initiative, which is hosting this talk today. The initiative aims to support practices such as mindful awareness and compassion practices in all facets of university life. And we do also think that these practices can support us as we engage in social justice work, which entail very difficult conversations, right? So I want to take this opportunity to wholeheartedly thank the folks who have helped or are currently helping make this event happen today. And a special thank you to our marketing and social media gurus, CAT's team member, Anais Sardinier, and the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion's team member, Laura Lopez Ramos. They both worked very hard on getting the word out about this talk. And to our co-sponsors, the program in the study of spirituality, thank you to their program director, Erin Weston. Erin, I know you're here. And to the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, thank you so much to their director, Emmanuel Bowles. And with that, I will pass it on to Emmanuel, who will introduce the one and only Loretta Ross.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. Good morning to all. Let me see, 143 and growing, everybody in the room. Good morning. I'm so excited to be here with you all to hear from our amazing speaker this morning. Thank you, Dr. Hernandez and the Center for Advancing and Teaching for coordinating this talk, as well as the amazing work that you all are doing. It's been a great pleasure in collaborating with you with our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts here at FIU. For those who don't know me, as Dr. Hernandez has said, I'm Dr. Emmanuel Bowles, and I serve as the Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at our great FIU. And I have the honor and pleasure of introducing our guest speaker for today, Loretta Ross. Professor Ross is an award-winning, nationally recognized expert on racism, racial justice, women, and human rights. She is someone who has faced the challenges of racism, sexism, and discrimination. Throughout her life, she has worked diligently to fight against the injustices that she and millions around the country have and continue to face. Some of her historical accomplishments include, but are certainly not limited to, being the national co-director of the 2004 March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C., the largest protest march in the U.S. history, being the founder and executive director of the National Center for Human Rights Education, and being the program research director at the Center for Democratic Renewal and Anti-Klan Network, where she led projects researching and working against bigotry within universities, schools, and community groups. She currently teaches as a visiting associate professor at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, in the program for the study of women and gender, where she delivers courses on white supremacy, race, and culture in America. She has co-written 3 books on reproductive justice, hosts the podcast Dread Feminist, I love that, and has won countless awards for her work as both an activist and a scholar. And today's talk, she seeks to create a movement that centers around building bridges between opposing views and seeking to create a positive foundation in which social justice can bloom. It is with great honor that I introduce Professor Loretta Ross. Please help me welcome her.
Thank y'all for that great and wonderful introduction. It's such an honor to be here. And before I start, I want to shout out to Mary Lisbon, who's a dear, dear friend going back 40 years, who I now find is a member of your family. So hi, Mary. Sorry you can't stay, but I'm so glad to connect with you. because it's been at least 10 or 15 years since we've connected. Um, I want to just start by saying that I have been doing social justice activism since I was 16 years old, and so it's been more than 50 years that I've been doing this work. And at no time was it ever easy to do the work because we are always up against the most ruthless forces in the world. I mean, we're fighting white supremacy, racism, misogyny, neoliberal capitalism, imperialism. I mean, we know the isms. I don't have to go into a litany of what we're fighting against. But what we have spent less time doing, in my opinion, is defining not what we're fighting against, but what we're fighting for. I think that we should be defined by more than the forces that seek to divide and oppress us. We should be defined by the visions that we have that matter. Because what happens if we win? Will we then replicate the same oppressive tendencies? That's all we know. Or can we envision doing something radically different? Well, of course, that's been a conversation I've had for many years. But I have to say that the reason I am lecturing now on the calling out culture is because of my grandson. I have to blame it all on him. He's 25, so he can stand Granny blaming him stuff. But when he was 12 years old, I found that he suddenly could not remember how to answer his cell phone because every time I called, it went straight to voicemail. And he told me, "Well, Grandma, if you want to get in touch with me, get on Facebook. That's where I am right now." So I got on Facebook, and needless to say, this tweener uh, immediately migrated off telling me it was for old fogies because he went to Snapchat or whatever the young people went to. But I was stuck on Facebook, and he's right, it is for old fogies like me. But what I noticed on Facebook was how unbelievably cruel people were to each other. I am convinced that people took license to say things to each other through the anonymity of social media, things they didn't have the courage to say face to face. And when I asked young people about this, they identified it as the call out culture. And then I asked, well, what are y'all doing about it? Because this isn't good. I mean, back in the 70s, we called each other out. We called it trashing back then, where we would gossip behind people's back and kind of exclude them if we didn't think they were politically correct. I mean, the most damaging thing we could say to a person when we did political work was that you're irrelevant. That was like the curse of mediocrity that we could offer back then. But we were also subjected to infiltration by the government, the counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO, which spent a lot of time fomenting dissent within our ranks, encouraging us to gossip about each other, badmouth about each other, accuse each other of various misdemeanors and malfeasance and all these kinds of things. And so we had to, in the midst of this, develop processes where we could learn to be self-critical before we became critical, where we could find unity even amongst our differences. And so when I found out that young people had named this call out culture, I began to imagine that the things I'd been through in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the aughts might be useful to this conversation because I certainly benefited as a young activist at 16 years old who was extremely mouthy, who thought I knew everything. I benefited from the fact that my elders didn't dispose of me. They did not dismiss insufferable me. They mentored me. They taught me what I needed to know, even if they didn't like me. And I'm telling you, they did not like me. I was growing these, dreadlocks popping out of my head, and they thought I looked like buckwheat, a horror that they were spending their lifetimes trying to get away from. Because they didn't know anything about Bob Marley, any of that kind of stuff back then and stuff. And they didn't give up on me. And so now as an elder myself, I am not giving up on young people. I'm offering them the lessons of my past. When I was director of the Rape Crisis Center in the 1970s, I taught Black feminist theory to men who had raped and murdered Black women. As a rape survivor, I never thought I could do that. I'd never thought that I could see the humanity of people who had violated women that just looked like me. I never thought I could do that. By the time I was in my 40s, I was deprogramming white supremacists who'd been in the Ku Klux Klan or the neo-Nazi movement. I never thought I'd have a civil conversation with the boys in the hood. Never, never, never. I mean, up until that point, I thought Klan people were like roaches. They only came out in the dark and you needed to exterminate them, kind of thing. And I worked for a man named Reverend C.T. Vivian, who was an aide to Dr. Martin Luther King. And Reverend Vivian used to always say that when you ask people to give up hate, then you need to be there for them when they do. And when he told me that, I went, oh, but I couldn't say it out loud because he's a minister. You can't cuss in front of a preacher, right? So I had to say it all under my breath. But I was not ready to accept that message, because if the Klan was okay with hating Black folks, I was all right with hating them back. I was so all right with that. But once I started and got assigned the job of listening to their pain when they tried to leave the hate movement, I started seeing them as human beings. And then once I saw them as human beings, I found I didn't have the capacity to hate them anymore because I humanized them. I saw the suffering that they went through that caused them to turn to hate movements. The people who were also abused by society, where their white skin privilege was the only privilege they had in terms of how they had gotten into the hate movement and stuff like that. And so pulling all that together means that I think that we who are elders have an obligation to do a couple of things. First of all, to recognize that young people have the right to determine the struggle on their own terms. We don't understand their reality right now. I mean, certainly I don't understand social media. I don't understand technology. My VCR is still blinking. I mean, obviously, I am so not the one to try to dictate to them how they have to deal with their technological landscape. And so we don't have the right to become their scolds, to say, oh, you must do this, or you're not this, or you're not that. Secondly, but we do have the obligation to challenge this myth of perfectionism that's driving the call out culture. Because perfectionism is such an aspect of white supremacy. It's a whole system designed to make you feel bad about yourself. Because under a system of white supremacy, there's only one group of people who are allowed to fail forward. Everybody else gets punished for every mistake that they make, with real dramatic consequences and stuff. And if you keep buying into that myth of perfectionism, which is only applied to the vulnerable and the powerless, by the way, it's never applied to the really powerful and the people who have privilege, right? Then you're constantly filled with the lack of self-forgiveness, with self-doubt. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I advocate in the calling in culture, instead of saying fake it till you make it, how about keeping it real so it doesn't break you? Wouldn't that be a much healthier way to engage with reality, so that you can acknowledge and admit that you may not have all the answers, but you'll never quit seeking them? You'll never quit striving for them, instead of trying to present this facade of having it all together and walking around in fear that someone will peek that you don't have it all together and then punish you for it. And the beauty of admitting your own mistakes ahead of somebody else discovering them is that then they can't weaponize them against you, because you already own yourself. Nobody can own you, kind of thing. So anyway, let me move on. So today I'm going to talk about the calling out culture and what we can do to call it a calling in culture. Obviously, I do this because I am a representative of what I call the human rights movement. I did not realize that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in his last Sunday sermon, March 31st, 1968, 4 days before he was assassinated, called on us to build a human rights movement in the United States. I always was told that he had a dream, but nobody told me he had a plan. So I was very shocked when I heard from Reverend Vivian, my boss I talked about, how Dr. King had a dream for us to build this human rights movement. And so the way I interpret that is because I'm a feminist, I'm part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement. But because I also care about racial justice, I'm part of the civil rights wing of the human rights movement. I'm disabled, so of course I am a part of the disability rights wing of the human rights movement. And I care about fighting hatred and bigotry. So I'm part of the movement to end homophobia, transphobia, anti-immigrant feelings, anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I'm saying is that we, whatever we focus on, can imagine ourselves as being part of the same human rights movement, even as we work in different sectors of it. And what that means is that we can't violate the human rights of people who are really our partners in the same movement. So I can't do women's rights work in a way that is homophobic, but I also can't do anti-racist work in a way that's xenophobic or hostile to immigrants. And I can't do work for trans rights in a way that's misogynist, displaying hatred of women. We can't just violate our partner's human rights and not undermine the human rights framework altogether. And so that's why I believe building a calling in culture is so important, because too many people within our movement come from a place of trauma and hurt, and they think that they don't have to be responsible for the hurt and trauma that they visit on others because they've been traumatized or hurt themselves. And then there's others in our movement who don't want to cause more harm because they know that we're dealing with trauma within our movement. So they tend to stay silent even when they can see the harm taking place within our movement. And so what I'm hoping that we can use the calling in culture to do is to strive to do our best without striving to be perfect. And in this vein, I've created something called the C5 continuum, the calling in continuum. Now, we're all very familiar with calling out. That's publicly shaming and blaming people for something that we think that they've done wrong, that we think we need to hold them accountable for. So, for example, uh, if you think somebody has told a racist joke or a sexist joke, you want to hold them accountable for it, and so you use, blaming and shaming, usually very publicly, to try to hold them accountable. Canceling is the ultimate call out, where you actually want them to suffer in some kind of way for the thing that you think they've done wrong. And so that would involve reputation loss or job loss or losing a platform. Now, along that C5 continuum, of course, is calling in. Calling in is a process of seeking accountability, but instead of using anger, blaming, and shaming, you are choosing to use love and respect as a way to pursue that accountability. And it is more likely to work, by the way, than calling someone out. Because when you call people in with love and respect, they are much more likely to want to dialogue with you, want to admit that they maybe need to rethink some things, redo some things, to engage in a conversation. Where when you're calling people out, basically you're inviting them to a fight. You're not inviting them to a conversation. And then the fourth aspect of the C5 continuum is called calling on people. And this is a concept created by Sonia Renee Taylor. And she says that she created it because calling out people or calling in people requires an investment of labor or emotional energy or political time in someone else's growth. And sometimes you don't feel like making that investment into someone else. So calling on is placing responsibility for the growth on the other person, where you're centering their behavior that needs to change, but you're assigning responsibility for that change to them, to the person who needs to do the work. And so my favorite calling on sentence, for example, might be, I beg your pardon. And then I just look them in the eye and see if they want to walk back those words. They didn't land in the way they possibly expected them to. Very useful, that thoughtful pause for people to reconsider the words that just came out of their mouths. And then the fifth aspect of the C5 continuum, I think we don't use enough, is calling it off. We have no obligation to engage in unproductive conversations with people. There are too many people who are not operating in good faith that we are just wasting our time on. And so it's really important to understand, whether it's in real life or online, you have a choice about whether you engage with people. You need to consider, is this a real good use of your time? Is it bringing you any joy? Is it doing anything for you? And since time is such a finite, limited dimension, wouldn't you be better doing something else? And so let's start with defining calling out a little bit more thoroughly. Calling out is criticizing other people's social justice practices while not being critical of one's own. And generally it's driven because people are feeling unheard, disrespected, or violated. They're feeling like someone has messed with them and they don't know what else to do. But one of the things I would often caution is that sometimes you need to take your pain to a therapist instead of a keyboard, because a keyboard ain't gonna necessarily provide any healing. And I find that people publicly can use their knowledge as a weapon against each other. There's something quite interesting about how someone will learn a concept, a social justice concept one day, and then turn around and weaponize it against other people. And there's a lot of identity essentialism and identity determinism that happens within that. So that we believe that because somebody has a particular identity, they have to be right and someone else has to be wrong, that kind of thing. And then a lot of calling out is driven because people banish people because they're not, quote, woke enough, that they think that they're in the middle of a woke competition. And so you've got to know the latest words, you've got to know the right politically correct saying, you've got to know how to use the right gender pronoun, you've got to know this, and you better be perfect and never make a mistake, because then I can, or someone can, call you out. But I maintain, as a 50-year activist, the fact that you think you're in a woke competition only indicates how unwoke you actually are, because we're not in a competition. We're not in an oppression Olympics. But the fact that you think you can virtue signal with your knowledge as a way of impressing others or building uh, your social standing in a community or boost your ego really just indicates how much growth you still need to do. It is, most people don't realize that when they call someone out, it actually may achieve the opposite of what they think it's going to achieve. Because instead of looking at the person you're calling out, we're looking at you and asking, why in the world are you choosing to display yourself that way? Why are you choosing to have me understand that's who you are, that you're choosing to show me? Someone who picks on other people, who bullies people with knowledge and information, who, I guess, if I need to be concerned about, because if you do it to them, maybe you'll do it to me too, those kinds of things. And I think sometimes it's driven by political purity of opinions, as if there's only one way to think about things. That uh what did President Obama say? We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, where we believe that it's very important to have the absolute correct political precision on everything. And anybody who doesn't agree with us should be shamed or bullied into either consenting with us. But the problem with that is that we're part of a human rights movement. And when many different people think many different thoughts and they move in the same direction, that's a movement. But when many different people think one thought and they move in the same direction, that's a cult. And we're not building the human rights cult. Now, calling out gets so quickly magnified that it's important to understand the taxonomy of what's happening because it goes viral so instantly. It can make a person go from, being just a regular person offering an opinion to someone who's a condemned, exiled political prisoner in minutes. And so it's really important to understand how calling out culture and cancel culture gets magnified. And I'm using calling out and cancel culture interchangeably. All call outs start with the presumption of guilt instead of a presumption of ignorance. A presumption of innocence. And so let's say that somebody says something at a meeting that someone else interprets as being sexist or homophobic or transphobic or whatever. So poor Joe says something at a meeting and somebody said, oh, I think what you just said was racist, sexist, transphobic, toxic. It doesn't really matter. And once that accusation is leveled against Joe, then there's a presumption of guilt, not a presumption of innocence like there would be in a legal system. It's just that just because someone has said that what Joe said was toxic, racist, sexist, or whatever, then everybody is urged to believe the declaration of guilt rather than to question the declaration of guilt. So it goes from accusation to presumption in instantaneously. And then it gets so quickly abstracted in the call out magnification that it goes from Joe said something that was racist, sexist, toxic, or whatever, to Joe is racist, sexist, toxic. And then it gets attached to Joe's moral character as a condemnation of Joe, who Joe is. And it doesn't matter if Joe is a black male or a white male or a black woman or a white woman or a trans person, or it doesn't really matter because these accusations can fly around so quickly that it doesn't matter the identity of the accuser, of the accused, so much as the identity often of the accuser is the one that most matters in an identity essentialism. And because this identity essentialism is conferred upon the accuser, that it takes a very pseudo-moralistic or pseudo-intellectual stance. I know what racism is because I'm black. I know what transphobia is because I'm trans. I know. And it's almost as if the person is presuming to speak for a whole universe of people that may or may not agree with their perspectives, but they don't care because they have chosen in a self-appointed way to be the condemner of what they consider transgressive behavior. And this is based on a false dualism, a false binary system of right, wrong, good, evil, straight, gay, etc. And we teach every day in our courses how false these artificial binaries are because the world is far more complicated than these absolute binaries. But there's part of the people in this effort to be a part of the human rights movement that needs to define themselves as the good people fighting the evil people. So there's this objectification and demonizing of everyone that you don't define as good or doing the right thing. And this carries with it an aspect or a culture of unforgivability because poor Joe is caught up in a catch-22. If Joe says, oh, I'm sorry for what I said, I'm sorry it had the effect of making someone feel racist, feel I was being racist or whatever, then they're going to be seen as gaming the system, offering a faux apology. But if Joe says, well, wait a minute, I didn't say anything wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. My intent was not that. Then Joe is going to be read as trying to evade accountability. So Joe is damned if he does and damned if he doesn't in an unforgivability culture. And of course, there's a lack of forgettability. That this thing happened to Joe will never be forgotten. That every time someone says Joe's name, there may be a whisper campaign. You know, he was accused of being sexist at a meeting, blah, blah, blah. Or he was accused of saying a joke that nobody really got. Or he was accused of doing da, 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 da. That kind of whisper campaign. And then poor Joe gets the political cooties because if anybody says, wait a minute, let's slow down. Let's see what actually happened before we start, lambasting someone who's on our team, or let's see what really happened. Then the person who's trying to say, whoa, let's slow the process down, then gets accused of agreeing with or participating in the same kind of malfeasance that Joe is accused of. So there's a political contamination and infection going on, so that then people start shunning Joe because they don't want to be guilty by association. And then next thing I know, Joe knows is that he's suddenly in a major gossip fest about what he apparently has done wrong or said wrong or thought wrong. And there's no way offered to correct, to crawl back, to deal with. And at the same time, no one gets a chance to ask the person who apparently was wounded by Joe why they're choosing to weaponize trauma that way. That it's not okay for hurt people to hurt people. And so some of the symptoms of calling out, I find, are pretty discernible. I generally find out that people who use calling out as their major tactic tend to size up people to see who they can safely call out, because they're not going to call out people that they actually think are a threat to them. They're going to say, okay, it's safe for me to call somebody out under this circumstance, which is why it's often done anonymously rather than face to face. And they're often doing it because they want to build community and get approval from others to see how woke they are and how on top of things. And I see a lot of call outs happen as deflections where they don't want to deal with the primary issues that are taking place so that they want to deal with something else. For example, I teach this course, as you heard in my introduction, called White Supremacy. And then there's almost inevitably in a conversation around white supremacy when somebody wants to pivot and deflect to something else. Oh, yes, I know we're talking about white supremacy, but I want to talk about why I got dead named today. I'm like, really? Really? What is going on? Excuse me, with you that makes you so uneasy to talk about white supremacy that you want to pivot to the topic we're not talking about. That's not about inclusion, that's about avoidance. And we can talk about transphobia and white supremacy if you'd like, but let's also keep focused. And I find that some people are perpetually looking for a fight despite the fact that they're constantly generating conflict with others and silencing them. And I think it's born out of this perception that they're supposed to win at all costs or dehumanize people who don't agree with them. And there's a lot of misdirected anger towards people who they don't feel, quote, protects them sufficiently in the way that they want to feel safe, because there's this myth that doing human rights or social justice work is supposed to feel safe, that you're not supposed to have the pains of new knowledge, the pains of growth, the pains of understanding the disconnect between your expectations and your reality. That people aren't supposed to have their own opinions and their opinions are not supposed to totally align with your own. And so that makes calling out very toxic. It replicates the carceral system of punishment that we claim to be opposed to. It discourages people from wanting to become human rights activists for fear that if they speak up and tell their truth, they may be called out because their lived experiences are not going to be the same as someone else's lived experiences. So it ends up gaslighting them in a way as they try to say, well, this is what I think about something, and their thoughts are unfolding and they're getting punished for not having the perfect thought, the perfect words, those kinds of things. And so that ends up driving people away from the human rights movement, making them very cynical and hopeless. And unfortunately, it disguises privilege by weaponizing language, by weaponizing knowledge. And that is such a misuse of the privilege of knowledge. And then it makes accountability very difficult. How can people be held accountable for the harm that they do if, in fact, just by speaking up and admitting that they've done harm is going to set them up for a firing squad? I mean, who runs to jump in front of a firing squad? That would be like nobody. And so it really does thwart our goal of accountability when we make calling out so toxic, because it increases the harm rather than the healing. And it spirals out of control, you know, often disproportionately in relationship to the original incident. So if somebody says something that somebody thinks is racist, like, you know, I live in a neighborhood with a lot of gunshots happening at night. And somebody said, well, you must be saying that Black people in that neighborhood are violent or blah, blah, blah. It's like, really? Really? The person was making a factual observation that then got interpreted as a racist assault kind of thing. And it assumes its own virality when it's done through social media. And I think this is driven by toxic perfectionism, where we alienate people with the pursuit of political purity or political correctness by assuming that there's only one right way to think or do. And, you know, then it makes people afraid, as I said, to speak up. They don't want to cause more harm. And so they stay silent. And then they, you know, afraid that they'll be thrown under the bus if they say the wrong thing. I find that also this toxic perfectionism judges other people's activism while not judging their own. And the way that we counter this, we have to listen to people with other viewpoints. And it really helps if you avoid toxic online communities and really ask yourself the question of why you're choosing to sabotage your own happiness with such unrestrained anger. Is it bringing you any joy? Because you really have a choice about whether you want to participate in making the world more cruel than it needs to be. And really, is this performance of outrage because people aren't perfect really working for you? I mean, are you auditioning somebody as a love partner or as a political comrade? I mean, really, and I'm telling you, even when you're auditioning them as a love partner, they're not going to be perfect anyway. And we have a tendency to use a double standard. So we tend to give political breaks to our friends that we sometimes won't give to others and stuff like that. Now, when people are called out, there's a commonality in how we respond to it. We become defensive, we feel shut down, we feel like we're getting mobbed by bullies who are trying to punish us. We feel angry and isolated, hurt and unheard. Sometimes we feel like our perspectives are being dismissed, or sometimes we'll turn around and attack somebody else if we don't go numb, because a lot of people report feeling like a deer in headlights. They're very numb when they feel like they're getting called out. They sometimes get into denial. They want to deflect to other issues. Sometimes these call outs take the forms of very personal attacks. And so people counterattack or, you know, set up a false equivalence. Well, what about this? You know, like the United States does when we call the United States out for its human rights record. We'll turn around and say, well, what about China? Well, what about this? What about that? Kind of thing. And then sometimes there's a lot of tears. We see a lot of white fragility tears, outrage, sabotage, and stuff like that. Now, if you are called out, which could happen to anybody, I recommend several strategies. First of all, thank the person for giving you that precious commodity of time and attention. You can sincerely thank the person for calling you out. I know that surprises you, but you can't, because they have awarded you something that is precious, time and attention. By thanking them, you are not conceding that they're right, you're conceding that they noticed you. The second step is to say, thank you for telling me that. I'm going to give it some thought and consideration, but thank you for bringing it to my attention. With that second step, you're acknowledging that they have been heard, that you are attending to what they said, but you are not conceding that you agree with what they said. But everybody wants to feel like they've been heard, that they've been listened to, and that they've been respected. So you can offer that in the midst of a call out, even if you don't agree with them. And you can say very clearly, I'm going to think about what you said. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. And then the third thing that you do, if you're called out, is to turn it into a calling in. And the way you do that is, again, you're staying calm. You can see I'm trying to urge you to stay calm in all of this instead of overreacting. And you can just say, I'd like to know what's going on with you right now, because you came at me in a fairly aggressive way, maybe a hostile way. You called me out when I'm sure that you could have gotten my attention in another way. So I want to know what's going on with you that made you choose to come at me that way. Are you all right? Are you angry? Are you feeling unheard? Are you feeling the need for someone to listen to what's going on with you? With those three steps, acknowledging with a thank you, showing that you've heard them, and showing that you demonstrate compassion and empathy for them, you can turn every call out that you experience, nearly everyone, into a calling in. Now, there is a reason that the whole call out culture is being deeply criticized right now. And Ta-Nehisi Coates writes very specifically about this, because he says that any sober assessment of this history must conclude that the present objections to cancel culture are not so much concerned with the weapon as the kind of people who now seek to wield it. Until recently, cancellations flowed exclusively downward from the powerful to the powerless. But now, in this era of fallen gatekeepers, where anyone with a Twitter handle or a Facebook account can be a publisher, banishment has been ostensibly democratized. And so what we're in is in an era right now where the people who previously had a monopoly on the call out culture, like, with the McCarthy hearings, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or with the demands for Hollywood movies to be censored or music to be censored or all that other stuff, now find themselves in the crosshairs of the call out culture, so that now that they've been spending a lot of time whining about their free speech rights and their right to get away with saying harmful things to, for, and about people without any consequences. It's not that they want free speech, they want free speech without any consequences. And that's not available because words do have consequences. Now, there are appropriate uses of call outs from the perspective of the human rights movement. When you have to use call outs in the instance of power disparities, when people are inaccessible because of their power, their fame, their celebrity, or whatever, you can use a call out to get their attention. You can also use a call out to avoid increasing harm. You can use the call out to find others that are experiencing similar harms or building community to prevent future harms by spreading information. And you can spread this information about unmarked or invisible areas of harm or patterns of discrimination or privileges, like institutionalized racism or what have you. And you do this by lifting up the voices for those who've been historically silenced. That's a good use of call out. It's also good to release all that pent up anger and outrage that we internalize, that we need to acknowledge and release. And there are a few times when public shaming works. But most of the time, call outs backfire because they don't achieve what you think they're going to achieve. And that's really important. So let me pivot and spend the last times talking about calling in and how we can learn a growth mindset to build a calling in culture. Now, calling in is basically a call out done with love. And instead of using anger, shaming, and blaming to achieve accountability, we're using radical love, respect. And it starts by giving each other the benefit of the doubt. And you've got to work to acknowledge that diverse people who are on the same team will have differences of opinion, and those differences of opinion are your sources of strength instead of sources of conflict. We always have to remember the broader context. Now, while we're busy calling each other out, there are people who are busily trying to deny us the right to existence. In other words, put it baldly, while we are a circular firing squad amongst the progressive world, we've got neo-fascists trying to deconstruct democracy. So we tend to lose perspective when we think that is more important to blow up our own side than to keep sharply focused on the people who want to work from an eliminationist mindset. Calling in requires us also to use active, loving listening practices that you can learn in any facilitator group and stuff like that. And it really requires us also to be grateful for this shared learning opportunity so we can be better together. So if you want to embrace the calling in culture, you have to start with the self-assessment. You analyze how you feel and why you want to call people in the first place. What's your motive? Are you calling them in because you want to achieve a certain outcome? Now, I recommend that you recognize that calling someone in or out displays who you are. It ain't necessarily revealing who they are. It really is showing how you're choosing to walk through the world, how you're choosing to be seen by the witnesses to this calling out that you're doing. And so it's really important for you to self-assess whether or not you're in a sufficiently healed enough space for a difficult conversation. Because if you haven't attended to your own healing from your trauma, then what you're going to do is more than likely bleed all over the person you're calling in or out. So you're not going to achieve accountability. You're just going to spread the pain and spread the shame. And your emotions, like happiness, can either make you feel more creative and open, or you can lead with your emotion of fear that makes you feel more shut down. These, again, are choices we make. We have no choice on the emotions we feel. The choices we have is what we do with the emotions that we feel. And we have to accept that we don't have the power to change others, but can only offer love and respect. But we are, in fact, calling in is what you do toward yourself so that you can self-determine how you want to walk through the world, so that you don't walk through the world just exhibiting what has happened to you. It's what you self-determine for yourself. And within a calling in culture, you may still disagree, but it's okay. Like I said, people are supposed to have different opinions, but all calling in starts with self-forgiveness. If you're not able to forgive yourself for mistakes, then it's unlikely that you'll be able to forgive others for making mistakes as well. And so there's a couple of sentences I'd like to leave you with. Like a sample calling on sentence is, I beg your pardon, as I used before. A sample calling in sentence is, when somebody says something that you don't necessarily agree with or like, you can say, I'm not sure what you meant by that comment. Tell me more. Very few people can resist the invitation to tell you more about what's going on in their heads. And by that, you de-escalate, you invite them into a conversation without indicating that you agree with what they said. A sample calling out sentence usually is with an exaggerated or escalated tone of voice. I can't believe you just said that. And with that, you have invited someone to a fight, kind of thing. Or a calling it off sentence can be, I can't engage with this right now, or I can't engage with this ever again in life. And you have that option of walking away. And so there's many roles in a calling out culture. And you get to decide what your role is going to be. Are you the survivor, the person who was harmed by what happened that needed to be called out? Are you an advocate for the person who was harmed? Are you an intervener that's trying to keep the situation from escalating? Are you a healer trying to help both the person who's accused and the person who is done the harm, both heal from that trauma. Again, asking that kind of question, what's going on with you right now that would cause you to come after so-and-so that kind of way? You could be a bridge builder, trying to find that common ground between people. Or you could be legitimately a bystander, because sometimes you're not in that emotional space where you want to make an intervention, where you want to speak up, and that's okay to be, because it may be you choose to do it at another time in another situation. You could be a truth seeker or a witness or a reflector who's trying to find out the facts of the situation. Was what Joe said objectively sexist, racist, or toxic versus just somebody's perception of it being that way? So you can do that by asking questions. So if you want to interrupt the call out, you can center yourself in your active love practices so that you can remain very calm. And this allows you to speak up through your discomfort, because it's not comfortable to speak up in the middle of a calling out situation. But like riding a bicycle, you'll get better with practice at it. And you can remind people of their human rights and their values and their need for each other, and the fact that they are on the same team. This often requires checking the emotional temperature of the room, and sometimes you can enlist other people within the room to work together to say, hey, these are things we need to look at so that we build a container where everybody's included, instead of assuming that because of a disagreement, somebody is disposable. It's sometimes necessary to redirect the conversation back to the agenda, or to decide, okay, we're going to put this conflict in the parking lot and get back to it at another time, and have an individual conversation with the person who is causing the conflict or who's being targeted by the conflict, that kind of thing. And you can help people really challenge their problematic behaviors, when you talk to them individually sometimes, but sometimes you have to address things publicly by making a plan for future conversations. And so when you're trying to build a call-in culture within a group, I recommend establishing some calling in ground rules, like don't hog the airspace, because people do process ideas differently and at their own pace. That you avoid those binaries I talked about, where people are not angels or devils or good or bad. That you understand the complexity, and that you actually delight in what Gloria Anzaldúa calls um, oh God, uh, I'm losing my thought of the word, the land of ambiguity. That's what I'm calling, because the mestizo identity. And that we understand that we're building a calling culture, and that's not a license to act foolishly or to abuse others or to be deliberately provocative, but it's an effort, an intentional effort to keep all voices in the conversation so that we can bring our best thinking forward and deal with conflict constructively. Because it's not about civility, it's not about being nice to people, or it's not about stifling debates or avoiding disagreements. It's about a constructive way, a constructive and productive way of having every voice in the conversation so that we can arrive at our best thinking. And you need to recognize as a ground rule that appropriate language is always shifting and group specific. So we can't have language policing in the calling in culture, and that mistakes are our learning opportunities, because all of this human rights work we're doing is just a big experiment, and we're going to fail more times than we succeed. But the sweet spot is when we get it right. And we have to stop attaching importance to who says what versus what is said, so that we can stop practicing that identity essentialism themselves. I get into a lot of controversial trouble because I don't use trigger warnings, because I'm trying to build a calling in brave space, not a calling in safe space where people will not be discomfited, where people will not say things that are challenging, that need to be interrogated, but in a way that's with love, respect, and grace. And as I say, it's not about disguising oppression with niceness. So I'm going to stop right there because I'm out of time, and offer a chance for Q&A. I've given a fairly dense presentation, which is my want. And then hopefully people can see how they can look at applying calling in techniques to both their personal lives, their professional lives, and their political lives. Thank you all for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Loretta. Oh my goodness, so much wisdom. And the chat, so many comments, reflections, has also been very, very lovely to read. So we're gonna use this time for anyone has a question, just drop it into the chat. Loretta, I'll share the questions with you. We do have a request that came in. If you can please repeat the C5s.
I'm sorry?
If you can repeat the 5 C's, the calling.
Oh, the 5
yeah,
C's?
yeah.
There's calling out, canceling, calling in, calling on, and calling it off.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the chat. Okay, do you have any recommendations for dealing with oppressive comments by folks on the quote unquote other team?
Well, I have an enlarged perspective of who I consider my team. In my trainings that I don't have time to do, I talk about spheres of influence. I consider most of us on this call what I call 90%ers. We are the people who, we don't represent 90% of the population, but we have such high degree of literacy with each other that we recognize each other's buzzwords. Like if we use heteropatriarchy, we know what we're talking about. If we use neoliberal capitalism, we know what we're talking about, those kinds of things. And our problem as 90%ers, because we have such a high degree of unity around our shared worldview, is that we spend too much time trying to turn our 90%ers into 100%ers, as if we should have perfect alignment on everything in order to be an effective movement. That is such a waste of time, because outside of us are what I call the 75%ers. These are people who don't use our elite language of heteronormativity, but they share our values. So for me as an abortion rights activist, for example, the Girl Scouts would be my 75%ers, because they believe in women and girls empowerment. Even though they may never lead a troop to defend an abortion clinic, that doesn't make them my enemies, and I'm not going to spend any time trying to turn them into 90 or 100%ers, right? And then outside of them are the 50%ers, people like my parents, who were, conservative Christian military, right? And so my mom and dad could go to the left or the right, depending on who last talked to them, because they were under an influence of their church and they were under the influence of their radical daughter. So they can go either way. The way I would talk to my mom, for example, is that I would speak to her values like, hey, mom, I understand that, your church spends time feeding the hungry, feeding the homeless every weekend. I really support that. But as a human rights activist, the way that I address that issue is that I ask why they're hungry in the first place. I'm working on your values, but I'm doing it in a different way. So most of the time, those 50%ers that can go left or right, if you go underneath their words and speak to their values, you'll find a lot of common ground. But you can't do so using that 90% language, because all that does is alienate them and make you think like you're talking down to them, that you are belittling their organic knowledge. And then outside of the 50%ers are what I call the 25%ers. Now, this is the group that I think your questioner is asking about. These are the people who we don't have enough overview, common ground with, or enough worldview with, that we're going to actually have a productive conversation with them. And unfortunately, some of these people are in our families, because they're the ones that believe that the election was stolen from Trump. that the COVID crisis is a manufactured conspiracy designed to poison people and stuff like that, you will probably not have the language that makes sense to them. But what you do have that makes sense to them is the ability to offer them respect, even as you disagree with them. And you could actually say with them, I don't agree with what you're saying or believing, but I respect your right to do so. And then you move on, right? Those are the call it off people, I call. And then there's the 0%ers, which are the neo-Nazis and the fascists, the people who delight in chaos, the people who want people to not get along because they find it politically expedient for them or profitable for them. And those are the ones I'm working to overpower. I'm not even trying to have a conversation with people who manipulate other people's fears for their own personal gain. And so my response to someone who disagrees with me depends on how I see them in my sphere of influence. Are they more likely to be persuadable because we have common values? Or are they more likely to have to be just overwhelmed with my power? Because I'm going to organize the 50%ers, the 75%ers, and the 90%ers to overwhelm the zeros and some of the 25s.
All right. Loretta, what do you think is our biggest challenge?
I think our biggest challenge is not believing in our success. The people who are opposed to human rights mistakenly think that they're fighting us. I don't think they're fighting us. I don't think they're actually fighting the human rights movement. I think they're actually fighting forces that are bigger than them and bigger than us. They're fighting truth. They're fighting evidence. They're fighting time, and they're fighting history. They're trying to deny the truth, bury the evidence, roll back the clock, and deny the history that's taken place, like the people who are opposing critical race theory and stuff. And I think any one of those four forces could kick their asses. I really do. I would not like to be part of the army that's trying to roll back time, truth, evidence, and history, frankly. And so my biggest fear is that with our call out culture, that we will snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory. Because we've got time, evidence, truth, and history on our side. We've got the strongest forces in the world on our side. So I'm afraid we might self-sabotage on the way to victory with the call out culture. So that's what keeps me up at night.
Thank you for that. So we have a question. So when conversations are high stakes for me, but relatively low stakes for my conversation partner, this means I struggle to share space sometimes when the quote unquote loudmouth is in the room, has no real skin in the game. Ideas?
Well, again, rather than pay attention to what they said, it's always an opportunity to ask them why they're choosing to say it at that time. You know, because like I said, with that responding to a call out, instead of letting them set the agenda with their misuse or working in bad faith, you can always turn the table and say, you know, that's an interesting perspective that you just offered. What's going on with you that makes you come at us this way? You know, what's going on with you? You know, make them explain themselves rather than you explain yourself, kind of thing. I find this, I call it my Uncle Frank strategy, because I have a relative who's not my uncle and not named Frank, and trying to keep him anonymous, who always comes to family dinners and blows everything up with his racist invective. He always has to say something bad about people being gay or people being Mexican, and he also has to say something, right? And so finally I asked Uncle Frank, I said, Uncle Frank, I know you would run into a burning building to save somebody if you could, because I know you're a good man, Uncle Frank. And so, since I know you're a good man, Uncle Frank, help me reconcile the good man that I know you are with the words that just came out of your mouth. Are you the good Uncle Frank? Are you the bad Uncle Frank? Tell me, which one are you to me? That's a calling on strategy, because you haven't called him out, nor have you called him in, but you're asking him to reconcile, to be accountable for how he'd like to be seen as a good person, but at the same time, he says all these awful things about other people. Which one of those are you going to own? Which one of those identities do you want me to experience you as? We can do that with almost everybody. You know, if there is some strong, there is an issue of power differentials. You don't want to go calling out people or calling in people who can't take a joke and will punish you for even identifying what they've done wrong. That's a different conversation. But I find that quite often within our families and with our loved ones, if we stop paying attention and just dwelling on what they said, but go underneath and ask them why they say it, and if they want to be that person in my life that way, quite often you can call on them to think about reconciling their own cognitive dissonance.
Loretta, do you have any suggestions on moderating conversations between people that agree that there is an issue, but have difference of opinion of how to move forward, the 75%ers?
Except that there's going to be many different paths to the mountaintop. There doesn't have to be one solution. You don't have to find the best solution, just find the one that works. So there may be a path to the mountaintop that works differently than your path to the mountaintop. So everybody has to be on your path? Isn't the goal to get everybody to the mountaintop? So we gotta let go of our conviction that we have all the answers, and that it's even necessary for us to have all the answers. The beauty, I actually learned this young, even before I started thinking about the calling out culture, because this was what the elders that I knew offered me. And they said, Loretta, you don't have to be perfect. The cause is perfect. You can be your flawed, imperfect self doing the best that you can. And like Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you'll do better. That's what we're working from. And so if someone is a 75%er and they think that there's another path to liberation, I'm going to say, good, do you, B, I'm all right with that. And I'm going to do me. And we're going to do this together in the service of our people.
Let's see. Okay, Loretta. Someone shared, I love the analogy of quote unquote Joe, but still not clear about how he should respond or not to the situation, even though he's damned if he does or doesn't.
Again, the three formulas I said, Joe in that situation can say, thank you for pointing out to me something that I may not have seen before. Thank you. I'm going to give it some consideration. Meanwhile, I'd like to know what's going on with you because you came at me this way. So I want to see to my own accountability, my own healing, but I also want to demonstrate that I care about you. I'm sorry that I might have hurt you. I'm sorry that I hurt you. Don't have to say mine. I'm sorry that you were hurt by what I said. I'm sorry that I did that. But meanwhile, what's going on with you? Because we're colleagues together and we have to continue to work together. So help us work together by telling me what's going on with you.
Folks want to know, when is your book coming out?
Hey, so does Simon and Schuster. The manuscript is due at the end of this month. And so I'm in a pretty much panic because I've got 373 pages and 173,000 words written that I have to trim down to 90,000. And, like any
Oh,
other academic, I want all 173,000 words in the book. I don't want to trim down to 90. So that's what I'm in the midst of doing right now.
yeah. We'll be looking out for that. Actually, the Center for the Advancement of Teaching, which is, hosting this talk, we have faculty reading groups. And we've already talked, like, we're gonna have a reading group on Loretta Ross's book. So we will be looking out for the release date. So somebody asked, why do you, could you explain why you don't use trigger warnings?
Because I'm a literalist, first of all. I should say I majored in chemistry and physics when I first went to college. So I've got a very linear brain. I'm a STEM girl. I have to confess that. And my logical mind says that being in a white supremacist heteropatriarchal society, by definition, is an unsafe space to be in. And so if being oppressed is not safe, I can't imagine why fighting oppression is going to be safe, because we're up against the most ruthless forces in the world. And so a trigger warning is a false overpromise that I somehow can protect you, or you can be protected from the reality of the truth. I asked my student, matter of fact, in my orientation with my class, when the class starts, I say, I have two options here as your professor teaching you about white supremacy. I can protect you from the truth, or I can teach you the truth. Which one do you think I'm going to do? Obviously I'm going to do the latter. And I cannot teach about white supremacy with the trigger warning. White supremacy, by definition, is the trigger warning. So I can't talk about things that will make you, I can't avoid talking about things that will make you uncomfortable. And by the way, I think the whole concept of trigger warnings is overused anyway. As a rape and incest survivor who had to co-parent with my rapist and stuff, and deal with my own trauma through massive 40 years of therapy and stuff, when you're triggered, you are involuntarily jerked into a past set of traumas that you can't pull yourself out of. You don't even know what present time is. You don't even know what decade you're in when you are actually triggered. So we overuse the term to describe anything that discomforts us. And I'm like, that's not how triggers work. If you can tell me what date it is, you aren't being triggered, you're just made uncomfortable. And so I don't pretend to have the psychological chops to deal with someone genuinely being triggered, yet I won't let words to be weaponized to misdescribe what's going on, the same way that someone having a debate with you over the use of a word is not re-raping you. Someone who accidentally dead names you is not committing a transphobic hate crime against you. I mean, this overstatement of harm, I don't play that bullshit. I really don't. I need people who are here for the struggle, who understand that the purpose of the human rights movement is to end oppression, not to provide you a personal therapy space. I know I'm blunt, harsh, and insensitive, but I try to speak the truth in a loving way.
I'm seeing the comments, you better preach. And you are real, in caps, real, and deeply compassionate. And I'm seeing real multiple times. And I would definitely agree with that.
We shouldn't walk around each other on emotional eggshells for fear that we're going to say the wrong thing. How does that help us grow together, bond together, trust each other, trust ourselves? we are being conditioned to fear each other when we most need each other. I find that totally unacceptable.
Yeah. I'm wondering what, so when you're in a conversation that, a difficult conversation that you would, that you can feel in your body, this is a difficult conversation, and you can feel uncomfortable. What are some practices or a practice that you may lean into that helps you stay in that conversation?
Um, First of all, I tend to have pretty clear definitions of who has the power to hurt me. And understanding that just because someone has the power to hurt me doesn't make them my enemy. And I actually learned that as a teenager because my mother was herself a victim of childhood sexual abuse. And she had the power to visit her trauma on her children, even as she loved us. Well, I'm not going to define my mother as my enemy just because she has the power to hurt me. We had to grow together and learn how, as survivors, we could love on each other and not let our trauma define our relationship to each other. And I learned that at 14 or 15, so I've had a lifetime of practicing loving through trauma. I just can't say any other way to say it. Loving through trauma. So I don't define who I'm going to work with by their ability to hurt me or not. Otherwise, I'd have to wall myself off from all people so I wouldn't risk being hurt, kind of thing. So what I tend to do is when somebody says something that sounds like it could be hurtful to me, I tend to see it as a reflection of them than as a reflection of me. So if someone offers me a microaggression, for example, I don't take that to my heart. I say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. You're in such a bad place that you would say something that off key to me." But I'm not gonna internalize their bullshit. You know, and particularly if you're not offering constructive feedback in a loving way. If you're offering constructive feedback, but I feel the love and respect, I'm gonna pay real good attention to that. But if you're offering it in a hurtful way and a harmful way, then I'm going to focus on who you are and why you feel the need to offer that hurt and harm, as opposed to taking it into my heart. My mother told me when she sent me off to college at 16, I went to Howard University, and she said, because of what I'd been through with the rapes and the incest and all of that, she said that she was proud of me. She said, because you don't let success go to your head. And I was always mouthy. So I said, "Oh, Ma, I know." She said, "Shut up, Loretta, because you always talk too much." She said, "You don't let success go to your head. But the most important thing I admire about you is that you don't let failure go to your heart." And so from 16 on, I've tried to live into that definition. My mother peeped that about me, that even when I fail, I don't let it go to my heart. I just try to do better the next time. And I can own the failure as opposed to being diminished by it. Because it meant I was trying. It was meant that I was trying to do something. And so Mom, she also told me I was mouthy. She was absolutely right. But she had identified in me as a child that the people who said that I wouldn't graduate high school because I'd had a baby, I felt the need to prove them wrong. The people who felt that I wouldn't successfully raise a child born out of incest, I needed to prove them wrong. The people who said that I shouldn't major in chemistry and physics, I needed to prove them wrong. But I had to do it because I didn't want their definitions of me to be the definitions I held in my heart. So that's kind of how I deal with stuff. I mean, it doesn't mean, and I mess up. The thing I understand that I can convey to young people: the larger your platform, the more visible your mistakes. when I make some mistakes I make end up in the New York Times or the Washington Post. I don't get to have private mistakes anymore, kind of thing. And so that's why you have to own yourself, own your power to make mistakes and forgive yourself for it so you can do better in the future. Otherwise, the fact that you're capable of making mistakes can always be weaponized against you.
Yeah, I think I can. Are you hearing an echo from me? No, I'm hearing.
No,
Something.
you're
Oh,
fine.
I think I speak for everyone when I say, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Clearly, it's difficult, but very, very needed. We really needed this today to um, to hear you share all of your insights, and answer all of our questions. Honestly, I can say that this has been one of the most insightful talks that I have been a part of in a very long time. So,
Well, can I encourage people to pay attention to my website, Loretta J. Ross, because
yes.
I do online trainings for people on the calling in culture for $5 a lecture. $5 online learning. I don't think it gets any cheaper or more accessible than that. And so the next class will start early in May. And so if people want to continue, feel free to sign up to the online classes.
And so I do want to say, and it would have been good for me to say this at the beginning, because I was like, I actually forgot myself, and I was like writing notes of, but this is being recorded, and it will be up on our website on the Center for the Advancement of Teaching's website since the Contemplative Practices in Education Initiative is hosting, it'll be part of that. But we're going to send you an email, everybody that's here, actually probably everybody that RSVP, just in case they couldn't make it, but I know a lot of people couldn't make it, but they still want to be able to see the recording. So we're going to send that. So look out for an email from Kat. And it'll be housed on our webpage. And also, if you are an instructor and you have not registered for the faculty workshop on Monday, this upcoming Monday, it's from noon to 1. Loretta Ross will be focusing on how we do this in the classroom with our students. And I will, okay, great. Thank you so much, Leanne. Leanne dropped the RSVP if you're interested in registering for that. And I'm just gonna hold this space so that you all can share any last reflections, thank yous for Loretta in the chat. So much love.
So thank y'all. Thank y'all for the opportunity.
Oh, so I think somebody asked what time okay. So Monday, it's from noon to 1. It's a 1-hour workshop. It's called The Practice of Calling In, Not Calling Out in the Classroom. I'm loving this. Thank you so much. You have opened, oh, I just missed it because there's so many comments coming in. This really opened my mouthy radical eyes, LOL.
Mouthy radical eyes. Yes, that so describes me too. Love that.
Yes, and a big thank you again for our co-sponsors, the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Program in the Study of Spirituality. We could not have done this without you. Thank you all so much for being here, and I hope to see many of you on Monday. And Loretta, I'm so looking forward to part 2
All right,
with
then.
you. Yeah.
All right, then. Well, bye-bye, y'all.
Bye,
See you
everyone.
on Monday.
Yeah.